as you all know, today's online discussion is looking at gender and the just energy transition. But before we start the session, I think it's important that we are all aware of what the aims of the session is. So we always have three aims before we start any session. The first aim of the session is us understanding how an inclusive gender integration looks like in a just energy transition. Not before I lose you. The name of the session that we had, I'm sure you saw it's the gendered lens. But today we're flipping that around and saying that instead of looking at gender through a lens, let's interweave gender when we talk about the just energy transition. When we think about lenses, most of the time you think about glass lenses. You can take them on and off. So that means when we're talking about gender through a lens, it's something that we can take on and off or just put to the side or add afterwards. But when we integrate something, think about a pen or my lip gloss, it's all mixed up, it's all in one. So that's what we mean when we're saying we're interweaving gender into the just energy transition so that when it's there, you can't remove it. It's already all in one. And then secondly, we're assessing whether policies and strategies that are in place currently support a just energy transition that interweaves gender. So decisions being made in government and in our society. And then lastly, we are creating a collective agenda on how to integrate agenda in the South Africa's JET on a local level. Local level because that is where communities and people are, instead of looking at things from a top-down approach. Before we start the session, I think it's also important that we familiarize and are aware of the terms and definitions that are going to be used throughout the session, so no one is left behind. Again, our session is on gender. You might be asking yourself, what is gender? Gender is often misunderstood with sex, in a sense that sex refers to the biological characteristics of humans, such as their hormones, their chromosomes, and their reproductive organs that distinguishes whether they are male or female. That is something that is assigned at birth. It is the things that make us and make up these body parts and who we are as a human being. However, gender, on the other hand, are the societal conforms of how someone is supposed to act like based on their physical appearance of male and female. So in the traditional sense or norm, when someone is female, they are assigned the gender of a woman. And with that gender label comes certain traits and responsibilities that someone is put in a box. So because you're a woman, you're supposed to be home cooking and cleaning. And if someone is born male, they are assigned certain roles, such as having to be a leader. They are seen as the crop of the creme. You are the leader. You are the one that makes decisions. And most of the time, the people that are labeled as women are put aside. And the issue with the traditional sense of gender is that it is binary, in a sense that it only considers two gender, men and women, whereas other people do not conform to any gender binaries of man or woman, or they could have been assigned a gender of woman, but don't take on those characteristics or take on that label. They might identify as male. Even when it comes to sex, there are certain people who are born intersex, in the sense that they are born with a varying mix of female and male biological characteristics. So they might have, to a varying degrees, both male hormones and reproductive organs as well as chromosomes, or vice versa. So even our lens of sex can be quite limited at times because of the binary traditional push when it comes to gender. So moving on forward, ask ourselves, what is a just energy transition? Simply put, a just energy transition is a clear shift from dirty and harmful monopolized fossil fuel systems to cleaner, affordable, and sustainable and socially owned renewable energies along with energy efficiency. Keyword here is monopolized. When we talk about monopolization, we mean that this fossil fuel system, which is the generation of coal, gas, and oil, is only controlled by a small percentage of people that are in high power that do not include communities on the ground when it comes to decision making, when it comes to how this gas and oil or fossil fuel is produced. And what the just energy transition is advocating for is that we have renewable clean energy that considers the voices of people. So that means that our policies and legislation have to change. And when we are moving away from fossil fuel industries, we consider the workers that are going to be retrenched or lose their jobs. We can't just leave them laying without jobs. And we should have resources that adapt our transition from a fossil fuel system heavily dependent on fossil fuels to renewable, socially owned energy. And then again, we can't speak about energy without speaking about climate change, because when we talk about fossil fuels, they contribute to the rapid climate change that we see. Simply put, climate change is the long-term change in the average weather patterns that are driven by fossil fuel industries. I see a lot of definitions saying it's driven by human activities, but we need to hold accountable these fossil fuel industries that are the large drivers of climate change by burning large amounts of fossil fuels and increasing the heat-trapping greenhouse gas fuels, thus raising the Earth's average surface temperature at a rapid speed. I believe that's why it hasn't been raining in Cape Town. It usually rains at this time of the month. But because of how heavily fossil fuel industries are burning fossil fuels, we now have the earth burning and heating up, that our weather patterns are not operating as they should, and the world is heating up. And then lastly, what is intersectionality? Intersectionality, if you go back to how I had described gender, simply put, is how people experience different things based on their identity. So this term intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. Kimberly Crenshaw says that they recognize, or there's a recognition that systems of oppression do not exist on their own. They are interlapping or intersecting with one another. That is racism, sexism, ableism, homophobia. When we are, as people have identities, our identities kind of clash. So the more oppressed identities that someone has, that for example, being Black and identifying as a woman, they face more isms. That is, they face more exclusion and oppression. And these intersections create distinct experiences for people. And the examples presented here is that, again, a Black woman with a disability may experience climate change through the combined efforts of racism, sexism, as well as ableism based on their identity. So because we exist in a world that mainly or mostly accommodates abled bodies, people with non-able bodies are not able to experience or adapt to even things such as climate change the way able-bodied people are. And because we exist within a white supremacy, racism also plays a factor on how a Black woman with a disability experiences the world. And then moving on to queer individuals, when we speak about gender, we shouldn't look at it only from a lens of woman. When we speak about gender, we talk about people that are vulnerable and marginalized. So queer individuals also make up people that are under the gender umbrella when we talk about gender, because they face intense displacement in the face of climate shocks, in the sense that they are removed and displaced from housing, because someone can get kicked out of their house because of the not conforming to traditional gender norms and because of their identity of not conforming to the binary, thus facing homophobia in cases where they would need shelter. Having discussed all of those definitions and what we're going to be talking about and having a clear understanding, when we talk about the just energy transition, it's important for us to take a step back and look into South Africa's energy landscape and climate overview as to why we're here. So South Africa's energy landscape currently cannot be understood or looked without confronting the deep and persisting relationships between mining and energy within this country. The electricity system historically in South Africa has always centered white people. So when it came to building power grids, intentionally at first, the main people that were being catered to, the consumers of electricity in this country, were white residents, white people, including industries that were owned by white people. And if we look at mining in South Africa, it it it's carried on the labor, the cheap labor of Black people. So when we have this history already of exclusion and putting people into deeper poverty and not thinking about the negative impacts that it might have, in today's society, it already builds a relationship that is shaped by the country's political economy focus rather than the people, because that's how the landscape has been for many years. So even if government changes and we have a Black government, again, still there's the monopolization where there is a small percentage of people in power still deciding how the energy landscape looks like without centering people and those affected. We see that currently today, after hundreds of years, how a province such as Mpumalanga, which has many coal plants, is affected by them in their environment. However, as much as we talk about Mpumalanga and them facing a lot of environmental degradation and ruins within the environment because of the mining that occurs that destroys the land and pollutes the air, and also contaminates water because heavy metal contaminates their drinking water, limiting the supply of clean water. It also affects us in different parts of the country, from Eastern Cape to Northern Cape to Western Cape. Reason being is that we also rely on energy, right? So what happens is that there is such a large reliance on coal-generated electricity from so many people in the country that mining industries constantly want to mine, but the problem is we're not looking at solutions. South Africa's energy and climate summary currently is this. Over 70% of our energy comes from coal. And it goes back to our heavy reliance on fossil fuels. Outside of Mpumalanga as a province, but throughout the entire country, we rely on energy. And how that looks like is that there's a high demand, yet a low supply. Because coal is a non-renewable energy, that means it's soon gonna run out. But there's such a high demand. When there's a high demand and yet low supply of something, that means the prices increase. Now that's why you'll find yesterday, or no, 3 years ago, you would have bought electricity for 20 Rand and maybe would have gotten 5 units, contributing factor. You would have gotten 5 units, but now you're getting 2 units. It's because resources are running out, but we're so heavily dependent on this non-renewable resource. And the climate impact of this is that extreme weather events happen. Because fossil fuels are contributing to such high carbon emissions, climate change now takes its toll at a fast pace, where we see in different provinces like KwaZulu-Natal, there has been devastating floods, especially in informal settlements where people are very vulnerable and cannot afford to find proper housing because housing has become so expensive. And then if we look at Cape Town, Day Zero is an example of the water scarcity that has been faced by certain provinces, such as Cape Town. And it's still foreshadowing, even today, there's discussions on the low supply of water in Cape Town. Even though it might not be as intense as Day Zero, but climate change is impacting the resources, natural resources that we have. And we also see this within our ecosystems and coastal erosions. There's high sea levels, there's low sea levels. The planet is just in such disarray by the quick and rapid emissions that there are, the greenhouse gases that are trapped in it, that are heating the world up. So I think moving then on forward, questions that we should ask ourselves is, how a just energy transition would navigate our climate, our changing climate. And again, an emphasis that to reach a JETS goal of cleaner, safe, and affordable energy, we must address the socioeconomic impacts and the health and the environmental burden and consequences that the fuel dependency has on our communities, as well as the livelihoods of people that are working within these fossil fuel industries, because people will have to be retrenched and move, but we should move them and build their skills so that when we are creating these renewable resources, we are already building skills so that they know how to work in these renewable industries. And then when it comes to our communities, we need to address the housing crisis that occurs because of climate change. When people, especially people in informal settlements, building informal settlements, but having floods take away their homes, we need to talk about the fact that people's land is becoming infertile because of mining. And now people can't rely on land to build crops and feed themselves. These are the discussions that we have. And when it comes to looking at South African policy, our white paper on energy also recognizes this importance to transition towards cleaner and safer energy because it realizes and it recognizes that we are a country that is too heavily reliant on fossil fuels. We need to start mixing in renewable energy in our energy future. Otherwise, we are in a state of a crisis. So how do we build this capacity for people? And how do we create discussions with people, considering the environmental costs of the heavy reliance on coal and how it looks differently from your Black disabled woman and your queer person that is facing homelessness? How do we face those discussions? By acknowledging that climate change is a real thing and that fossil fuels are exacerbating climate change in itself. So talking about these things, not just in silos or separately, but in one, and then putting in gender in the middle. So again, why energy is a gender issue? Why are we even having this conversation? So according to AIDC's 2025 report on energy poverty, over 10 million households across South Africa live in what is described as energy poverty. This is a term that basically means that households lack safe and stable, affordable electricity. Number one, a sign of that is not being able to afford to purchase electricity. When people have to negotiate between buying food and buying electricity, that is an example of energy poverty. When people don't have access to grid line access and have to use dirty fuels such as paraffin, wood, and coal, that is energy poverty, and it's a crisis that we should deal with immediately. Other added additional factors to this energy poverty is gender-based violence, especially in much more rural provinces or areas that are in the periphery or kind of outside. They can't afford electricity or they don't have access to electricity, whether that is not being connected to the grid or being connected to the grid. But me coming from the Eastern Cape, we have grid access, but sometimes the municipality does not provide electricity for people on days on end. So what happens is that due to the gender constructs, as we said, women having to take care of the household, having to cook and clean because of gender conformity, they are left vulnerable. Women and girls are left vulnerable because now they have to go out, chop wood to make fire. They have to light candles. They have to light parafina to cook, and that leaves them in a vulnerable state of having no electricity and then having a chance of criminal activity occur within the household, of going outside in dangerous spaces and exposing themselves to dangerous harm. And also the cutting down of trees contributes to the deforestation and ecosystem destruction because now trees that are supposed to give us oxygen are being cut out, meaning that more carbon emissions are being spread into the air, and now we're breathing in more dangerous air. Health is another additional impact of energy poverty. Because if we're lighting these paraffins and candles, it's a danger to our safety. and indoor air pollution from these fuels has resulted in over 1,000 deaths yearly in South Africa. And again, this disproportionately affects women and children because they are vulnerable in marginalized communities, and it leads to their death. And now when we talk about people that are not able-bodied, they are left vulnerable in cases where electricity is not there because a lot of people rely on medical devices to be on for their health. And also in some cases, if someone has diabetes, their health is compromised because their medicine has to be put in the fridge and be cold in order for them to take them. So again, energy poverty, which is exacerbated by climate change and climate change exacerbating it, threatens the lives of peoples and it interrupts their way of living. From the intersectionalities that I have shown, which has been health, as well as safety, it's important to note that there are multiple intersectionalities that exist outside of the ones that I've mentioned, like food and agriculture and disaster management, as well as climate migration and displacement, where people have to leave their countries because that they don't have land to farm on, there's droughts, etc., which is a cause of climate change, and having to move to a space that does not welcome you. That is an example of gender and climate playing a factor into their lives. And even the ones that are not listed here could be added, things that you would think of that impact someone's livelihood. And go back to Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionalities and overlapping of oppression. Kimberly Crenshaw might have coined it, but we all recognize it, so it doesn't belong to just one person. And then when we think about intersectionalities, and looking at this shape here, this is a visual representation of how intersectionality looks like. As we see, these circles are all interlapping with one another. Gender is on top of climate, climate is on top of gender, vice versa, and they all come together. An example of how gender and energy intersect or overlap one another is that people face energy injustice differently. So women and marginalized people's genders, because of their gender, and their vulnerable identity and whatnot, face energy injustice differently per se with how a man would, and how someone with a disability or someone who is queer would. And our current energy system doesn't meaningfully include these groups in decision making, and it does not consider the different and various aspects and needs that each person requires. And then when we look at climate and energy and how they overlap, the current fossil fuel energy system that we have in South Africa is a massive contributor to the worsening of our socioeconomic environment impact, because electricity or energy is becoming more expensive because fossil fuels, again, are non-renewable resources that will eventually run out and are causing harsh damage to our environment. So it only worsens the conditions that we are living under. And then moving on to gender and climate and how we can see they overlap and intersect is that climate change and gender is not neutral. So just because I am a man and just because you're a woman or just because you are non-binary does not mean that we do not face climate change. Everyone faces climate change. It's just that based on your identity and the available resources that you have that are contributed based on your identity, we face it differently. So a white man living in Constantia will face climate change very differently. For them, it could be like the sun is hot and then they buy a fan. They have resources based on their identity because they might have access to financial resources. Where a young child in Philippi who's living in an informal settlement who doesn't have access to those financial resources, if a flood were to happen, they don't have another space to go into because of their identity. They face more isms than a white man, a rich white man living in Constantia. So when we think about intersectionality within these different aspects, Jet is in the middle. where you see this middle part here. Jet is the answer that looks how we can interweave. So when we talk about integration and interweaving, it means blending all of these and finding solutions that consider all of these different aspects. Before we move on from that, we can talk about the Cancel Call campaign. So the Cancel Call campaign is an example of a campaign that considers the just energy transition as well as gender, because it in itself is a campaign that was youth-led. And the reason why I say it's an example of how gender and jet is interweaved with one another through when it comes to energy is that young people were the center of the movement in itself. So in 2024, the High Court delivered a victory for young people and climate justice in South Africa after the court ruled that the government's plan to add 1,500 megawatts of new coal-fired power was unlawful. And because it failed to properly consider children's rights, health, and impact, and the availability of cleaner and cheaper alternative, it wasn't a legal win. So this is an example of a gender and jet a campaign because the youth organizations that were leading this campaign were considering future generations. How are future generations going to be impacted if we add additional coal-fired power plants? How does that look like? And even the voices that were here, it centered multiple youth leaders and activists, and also community members with the petitions that were signed. And it looked at informing people about renewable energy, saying that fossil fuels are not the only answer. We can also delve into cleaner and cheap alternatives for energy instead of going for energy that just goes into looking at only the political and economic interests of government, but also looking at the environment aspect of it. For more info on Cancel Call, you can go to cancelcall.org.za. Today, on the 19th of August, is also the appeal against the government trying to appeal the court case that they won in 2019 on adding this 1,500 megawatts of new coal. And you can just read more on the campaign itself on cancelcall.org.za. But before we move on from that, today we have our expert speaker, who was one of the young activists at Cancel Call. Tulumango Nkasela will be joining us today to discuss jet and gender. And Tulu, if you are present, can I just hear your voice?
Yes, Mbali. Hello, everyone.
Hi. Today we are joined by Ukulu. And a question that I would love to ask you, Kulu, is as a climate activist, um, how does gender and energy connect with each other?
Thank you so much, Mbali. I'm just gonna keep my camera off, just for network for other people that are struggling with network. Um, it's very interesting for me. Once again, thank you so much for having me. As I was saying, it's very interesting for me about gender, energy, and the climate as well. I really like the fact that you were saying when we speak of gender as well, we're not only just speaking of women, but we're speaking of everyone because everyone has gender, right? And everyone experiences gender as this construct that gives us these certain roles and all of that. Because often when we speak of gender, people only think of women and people of marginalized genders, and they don't think of men when we speak of gender. I was very disappointed at one of the gatherings that I've attended over the years, and we're asking people their pronouns, and we got to a person, they were like, well, I'm not queer, so I don't have pronouns. And we had to go through the trouble of explaining that everyone has pronouns, everyone has gender. It is not something that is reserved for women or reserved for people of marginalized genders and all of that. So when I'm thinking of gender, I'm thinking of everyone within that umbrella, from women, men, non-binary person, and so on and so forth. Right? However, when we are speaking of gender in these kinds of settings, we do so in a way that centers women and marginalized genders, right? Because of patriarchy, they have primarily been the people that have faced the brunt of the abuse and also the brunt of the disadvantage. So it's important that we then center women and marginalized people, but everyone has gender and we have to speak of it holistically, right? So when I think of gender, energy, and climate, I tend to lean towards the fact that even with the case with cancel call, we're looking at things such as care work, all right? Where this is a type of role that is typically taken up by young girls, young women, and typically mothers as well, where they're taking care of their families. And this includes doing things such as washing the dishes, washing children, cooking and feeding everyone, taking care of the family from, the father, if the family does have a father, from the father to the very youngest member of the family. This is typically the work that is done by women, by mothers and young girls in our communities, right? And this is a type of labor that is unpaid. And so when we look then at energy, which encompasses and includes the burning of fossil fuels, like you were saying, for our energy, and let's bring it back to coal, for example, as a type of fossil fuel that has to be burned for our energy, and that leads to sickness, right? One, that leads to sickness. And two, it also leads to pollution, which ultimately collapses our environment. Of these two, then, when you have sickness, that means the burden of care work is increased on young girls, young women, and mothers, because then you have to take care of the sick people, because typically the care work is done by you. So you're having to take care of people that fall sick, typically children that will fall sick with things such as asthma, silicosis, and those kinds of things, right? And so it is typically the mother that has to do that. But another aspect that we also have to look at is if you are a mother or you are a woman or you are a person that has a partner that is working in a coal mine, they're also going to get sick. And typically people that do work in coal mines or in any kind of mine, it is men. And what happens then when that person gets sick and comes back home? It is also the woman, the mother, the young girl, the daughter that has to take care of the father. I don't know if maybe I'm a bit old at this point, and maybe some people might relate to the story of Yesterday. And it's a movie of this woman whose husband is working at the mine, and the husband comes back sick, and she has to take care of the husband after not having seen him for years. And so these are the kinds of things that we have to look at then when we're looking at energy, and we're also looking at gender, in how the way that we get to turn on and flicker our switch here, how that electricity gets to that switch, and the kind of price that has been paid by people, but particularly women and people of marginalized genders as well. And it also comes back to the environment collapsing as well when we're bringing it back to our climate. Again, the accelerated way in which we're seeing our climate change over a period of time is particularly because of the human activity of burning fossil fuels, so fossil fuel industries, right? And so if we are then having an environment that is collapsing, that is causing the climate to change, and is causing climate-related disasters, again, the burden of care work increases, and that is once again placed on women. Right. And also when this kind of thing happens where we have climate related disasters, we then also often come with blanket approach situations and try in terms of trying to help people instead of looking at what are the kinds of needs that maybe a transgender person would have in that kind of instance? What are the kinds of needs that a child would have in that kind of instance where there is a flood and people have been displaced and have to be relocated? The kinds of medication that are brought on, the kind of medical help that is brought on in those kinds of cases as well. And I think the other thing that we also often don't really look at is the fact that also people get sick, and often women in times of climate disaster, women and young girls also often have to not look after themselves but look after other people at times of disaster. But one of the bigger ones as well is that gender-based violence increases exponentially when it is times of climate disaster. And that is not something that is being looked at sufficiently. It increases in the context of the home and household, so between partner, spouse and spouse, or partner and partner, domestic partner and partner. But it also increases in terms of the healthcare workers abusing women and children and young girls in these kinds of settlements that people are then moved to when they are displaced. And that's not something that is really being looked at. And I remember, I think it was with a cyclone that had happened in Malawi. I think it was Cyclone Freddy. And there were reports of how, because of the cyclone, people had been displaced. The amount of abuse that young women, young children, young girls, and even elderly women faced, the type of abuse that they faced, and gender-based violence that they faced during that time of disaster, and how that was never properly dealt with. And so often then when we're thinking of climate change and gender, of climate, gender, and energy, and how they intersect, for me, these are the kinds of experiences that I am thinking of, how the way that we pursue to get our energy affects our climate, but also the way that affects our climate also increases a different type of burden for women and people of marginalized genders, and them being able to get access to certain services, or them being impacted in different ways socially, ekuhlaleni, and the kinds of experiences that they have, particularly because of who they identify as in terms of their gender. And I mean, Kimberly Crenshaw puts it really nicely when looking at the different isms that people are faced with. And I like that framework, particularly because at the time, Kimberly Crenshaw, as a lawyer, was helping out Black women who were working at factories, and looking at the fact that your experience is very different, and it is very particular, and is very specific. You know, it's very oddly specific. And looking at things such as, how do we see capitalism translating itself in our communities, abusing all people of all kinds of genders, but abusing them in different kinds of ways, and how that has put people's lives under profit, and profit is something that has been, prioritized over anything. And so when I'm thinking around these conversations of energy, gender, and climate, I'm also thinking of how our class as people, whether you are of working class or not, but also your race, because also the way that these kinds of burdens as well, or benefits of our climate and our environment, are shared, are very uneven. You see certain types of communities getting more of the benefits of our environment and of our climate, and then you see other certain, particularly Black and brown communities, then getting the burdens of climate change and of our environment, and also being put squarely where the coal mining is happening, where the other types of mining is happening, and even coming back and saying, well, you've been placed there, but we want to move you and mine, and those kinds of things. And so those are the kinds of intersections that I'm seeing in this Venn diagram of climate, gender, and energy, and how they then produce this sort of tripartite that we then have to try and deal with, because we can sort of see clearly the kinds of issues that it brings together.
Thank you, Kulu. And then I think a question that I'd love to ask is that, again, as a youth activist that was also part of this Cancel Coal campaign, with the things that you have mentioned, how do you think that cancel call campaign is an example of how gender intersectionality can be fully interwoven when it comes to the just energy transition?
I want to say one of the unique things that Cancel Call did in, I think, the continent, or maybe even might be ambitious and say even in the world, one of the things that Cancel Call did that were unique was bringing forward youth voices and having a case that was young people and children led to say we have a right to a clean environment. And I think over the past couple of years, we have seen over the past decade a trope of young people speaking out about the kind of environment that they deserve to live in and the kind of environment that they deserve to have in future as well. So I think Cancel Call really put us in a unique position where we could look at things from the eyes of a person who wants to have the world still be there in the next couple of years or in the next 20, 50 years. And how this case then illustrates how, gender and intersectionality and energy can come together is, I think it also brings us exactly to the conversation around care work, because Cancel Call as a court case was speaking to the kind of sicknesses that were being brought by coal mining to the communities in Emalahleni particularly, you know, and how children were getting sick, and not getting sick because there's no other options as well. There are other options, and Cancel Core was presenting those kinds of options as well. But I think it touched on that, particularly because there were affidavits from parents, from young people, parents saying, my child has had to live with asthma, for example, since they were a baby. And the amount of trips that I've had to take to the clinic or to the hospital, again, speaks to the burden of the care work that the fossil fuel industry is putting on women and on mothers as well. But like also hearing from young people saying, this is the kind of way that I'm affected by the coal mining in my community and so on. And this is how my environment is collapsing. This is the kind of uncertainty that I am faced with. And I've had the opportunity, fortunately or unfortunately, to visit some of the communities in Mpumalanga. And, the water is not drinkable, those kinds of things, people, sometimes you can literally smell, from the water itself, how it smells. And all of that. You can imagine the kinds of things that would do to your skin and so on. So there is there's a lot of issues, that Cancel Call brought to the fore and made us to unpack and also debunk some of the myths, around jobs, and what canceling coal will mean for people's jobs, what bringing clean energy will mean for people's jobs, what that will mean for our healthcare systems. Because also, if people are getting sick, then that means healthcare systems are strained, which is one of the things that were brought to the fore. But I think the other thing that was also very interesting, it brought together that intergenerational sort of conversation where you have all people of all ages basically supporting this kind of campaign, supporting this court case to say young children deserve to have a safe environment that is livable, and the government owes them that. And on top of that, young people deserve, and all kinds of people deserve to be consulted, and they have every single right to then say, yes, we can, or no, we can't. And that was the kind of thing that, for me and in my experience, Cancel Call sort of exposed me to seeing that intergenerational fighting between young people, holding hands with older people, people who are young at heart, and coming together and saying, we have to hold the government accountable.
Thank you, Kuli, for that insight. And just kind of giving us your your own experience when it comes to cancel call and how that campaign is very integral to how we as youth, but not only youth, but people who care for the environment should start looking at when it comes holding those in power, saying no to the monopolization of fossil fuel and saying yes to transitioning towards a just energy transition of renewable energy rather than fossil fuels that damage our environment and only contribute to climate change and worsening it. So, when having those discussions, the main important question for this online discussion, which would be futile if we do not ask this question, what are the things we should consider to fully weave in the just energy transition? So, pointers that were made from gender and inclusion of communities, especially those are vulnerable, and are mostly impacted by energy poverty. For gender to be fully woven into the just energy transition, we should not treat it as a standalone issue or a box ticking exercise. From Tulu's encounters of how communities in Mpumalanga, which are very much directly impacted by the extraction of coal mines, is that women are impacted. This is not something that just happens alone. It's a consequence of the extractivism or the digging of coal. Therefore, we should treat these things as something that are intersectional and are weaved in together rather than its own thing. And that also goes into when we are planning and inserting people within discussions. When we're talking about public participation, we don't only add people, especially communities, at the end, when things have already been done, and just saying, oh, yes, we told them about what is going to happen. Now we move on. And when we are budgeting and saying, oh, we are going to be giving South Africans 1.5 megawatts of electricity to power their houses, is that what people want? And if it is this the way that they want to go about it? And again, to Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality framework, is that we should recognize that women and queer people, as well as people with non-able-bodied people, and youth, that is children and future generations, as well as other marginalized communities, such as climate immigrants, experience energy systems very differently. And therefore, we should consider the central role that energy plays for them and how we should go about energy planning. So factors look like participation, changing the way that we look at public participation and decision making. So our government, from national, provincial, and municipal, should consider the affected workers and women and organizations and youths, et cetera, that are interested and affected parties from the earlier stage of design, rather at the end when you are giving only people 30 days to comment on a development or policy that is happening. Have people in the beginning so that we don't have to give people a limited of 30 days to reply to 200-page extensive policies that are going to change the trajectory of how their livelihoods look like. Participation must also be accessible. So when we are having these discussions, if you are going to have a discussion on building a solar, even renewable energy, a solar panel or whatnot, don't just put it in an area without considering the people that are staying there. There should be community knowledge. There should be community participation in the proposal of changes that are being made so that people are not being displaced and excluded. Planning needs to be gender responsive. So every energy policy should include the gendered rights and look at the different intersectionalities, recording the identities of people from gender, age, disability, location, income, employment, status, et cetera, of the communities that you're going to impact, and seeing how are you going to better the condition of these people? How are you going to mitigate certain areas and problems that will arise when decision is being made? And then when we look at transitioning from fossil fuel monopolized energy into a just energy transition where we're promoting and advocating for renewable, clean, and sustainable energy, the energy should be the people's. We should look at community ownership of renewable energy. That means women and marginalized people must participate in the governing of their energy. Looking again at land, how land is going to be distributed, how processes of settlement are going to happen if a project needs to happen in a specific area. There also needs to be the care, safety, and rehabilitation of the damages that have been caused by fossil fuel industries. Because we can't talk about a just energy transition, yet we fail to address the trauma that has been caused by climate change, the emotional, the social, the economic, et cetera, that has been caused by these fossil fuel industries, and say that now we are moving to renewable energy, because that is the disconnect that happens when we talk about climate change and the just energy transition for especially marginalized and vulnerable groups, and people not I wouldn't say understanding, but not being privy to the intersectionalities, because it seems as though there's an agenda of just renewable energy that is being pushed without addressing and pointing and educating to people how these intersectionalities happen, why they are there, and how their energy is linked, how housing is linked, how gender-based violence plays a factor into this, and groping people in by caring about them, by caring about their safety and their health. On my side, those are the pointers that I have on interweaving gender. I will then bring Khulumangno in for her own perspective as an expert and just drive the question on what are the ways that we can meaningfully interweave gender, energy, and climate at a local level where the people are, while considering the different and unique needs of everyone that gender intersectionality talks about.
I think a point of departure for me would be to bring it back to, excuse me, the exactly the kind of work that we just spoke about that Cancel Core did, where Cancel Core looked at the needs of one of the most vulnerable groups, which is children. And that's exactly what we need to do. We sort of need to map the needs of each and every group. What are those needs? And I feel that honestly, that is the kind of thing that we fail to do even when there are climate disasters. Like I said, we sort of come with blanket approaches in dealing with things, in trying to address disasters and all of that. However, it is important that we look at the singular needs of vulnerable groups, and at that level, then you can look at in cases where there were floods, for example, in Durban, in the Eastern Cape, in Umtata, with the floods, looking at the kinds of needs that speak directly to care work that women are faced with, for example. So that's the kind of thing that we can look at in Cape Town as well, with the flooding that happens all the time in winter, and also the fires that happen all the time in winter. And that also speaks directly to energy poverty. And the fact that it is cold and people need to keep warm, and that kind of thing. And if we were to be able to do that, we would then be able to prevent things before they even happen. We'd be able to prevent that fire before it even happens, because we're able to sort of try and rehabilitate the situation,
Mm,
right? But I
mm,
think also it's important that, again, one of the lessons that we take from Cancel Call, which is to consult with communities. That was one of the things that we stood on with Cancel Call, and that you need to consult with communities. You need to consult with the people that are affected directly by what is happening. It is, these people, these households that are, when you are blasting for coal, are affected. It's their houses cracking. It's them that have sinkholes on the road And you don't know when one day you might be walking and the earth beneath you just collapses, and it is those kinds of people that need to be consulted, and they need to be afforded their right to be able to say no or to be able to say yes, to these kinds of things. And that's a very important process. And I think even at a local, provincial, or even national, even an international level, it is that kind of consultation that is important, because then we avoid repeating the same mistakes, the mistakes of history, where we force things on people. We avoid repeating the mistakes of lest we even call them mistakes, but we avoid repeating that history of colonization as well, where even with the just transition itself, or even the transition, actually, let's say just transition, with the transition itself, actually, from fossil fuels to renewables, we must avoid that, where we see communities being moved to open way for solar plants, to see communities' water sources drained just so that, the solar plants can be cooled down. It is exactly the kinds of things that we need to steer clear from. And that's the kind of way that I'm thinking when we interweaving gender into these kinds of things, and we sort of what do you call it? When we sow through, with intersectionality and with an understanding of vulnerable groups, with an understanding of people, with an understanding of humanity, we are then able to stand up and say, okay, we are now transitioning from this kind of energy to this type of energy. How do we then make sure that when we're looking at solar energy, we're not repeating the same things that your Shell or your Total Energies did, right? Um, it is those kinds of conversations that we must start having. And I think those are the kinds of conversations that, once again, Cancel Call really brought us to. And I think it's very it's quite surreal that they were back they were at the Supreme Court of Appeal today as we're speaking about the kinds of lessons that we're drawing from Cancel Call, as we're speaking about the kinds of things that the court case has inspired, and how we look at the situations that we faced with, the challenges that we faced with, and how we address them by interweaving, gender and intersectionality, and so on and so forth. But I think also, just lastly, being aware of time is positioning people's lives and livelihoods over profits. That's important. I think we see that as well from a local level, and once again to national, international level, where people's lives are not, positioned over profits. People are constantly, especially people in positions of leadership, are constantly concerned with profits. And I think if we were to start to think about things a bit more intersectionally, how you were saying, Bali, at the beginning, that women in leadership are not really looked at as people who are powerful, who are able to lead, and all of that. And it is because of stereotypes that are driven by patriarchy and all of that. But sometimes I think to myself that if we were all to start leading like women, if we were to center the way that historically we've seen women leading with compassion, leading with power, leading with passion, as well. I think that is when we would start to be able to position people's lives over profit, where we're not concerning ourselves with how much money we're able to make. And right now, as things stand, for the first time, and it sounds so ironic, for the first time in a very long time, South Africa has an excess of electricity. And South Africa is at a point where we don't know what to do with so much electricity that we've generated. And that's so ironic considering the kinds of things that people have gone through for that electricity, and also the kinds of things that people are currently going through for that electricity, and for them to not even have proper access to that electricity because they cannot afford it. So I think it's very important that we look at how the different facets of people's identities affect each other, and start by addressing those even from a very low level There's so much that we could do. If we were to look at the fact that, oh, you're a black or you're a brown person, you're a white person, you're a working class, you're women, you're queer, and how does this shape your experience of climate change and your experience of energy? We would get very far in terms of, you know, moving with the just transition and even thinking about the ways that we want the just transition to carry out.
Mm. Thank you, Khulu, for those pointers. Interesting point about South Africa having an excess amount of electricity and not knowing what to do with it yet. On the ground, that is not visible at all because electricity is quite expensive and there's still people who do not have access to affordable and reliable electricity. Um, and I think just closing it off with local level that when it comes to decision making and centering the unique needs and of people when it comes to energy, that again, when you think about different provinces and the way that they face energy poverty varies, and the needs for energy also varies within province by province. So again, there's national policies and decisions being made, but are they considering the local interests and needs of people when it comes to energy?